It was the summer of 2014 when I took a job working for a small logging company in northern Minnesota. I wasn't a professional by any means, just someone who needed money and wasn't afraid of hard work. My boss, an older guy named Roger, had recently purchased a plot of land deep in the woods, a good 50 miles from the nearest town. He planned on cutting down a section of trees, milling them, and using the lumber to build a few rental cabins for hunters. Until then, someone needed to stay on site, keeping an eye on the equipment and making sure no one came snooping around. That's where I came in. The cabin I was given to stay in wasn't much. A simple single-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a rickety table that looked like it had been built decades ago. There was no running water, no electricity, and the only way in or out was a winding dirt road that barely passed for a trail. Roger gave me a satellite phone in case of emergencies, told me he'd be back in a week to check on things, and left me with enough supplies to last until then. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my days stacking firewood, making sure the generators were fueled, and walking the property to familiarize myself with the area. The nearest structure was an abandoned shack about half a mile away. I didn't know its history, and honestly, I didn't care. It was falling apart, covered in moss, and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The only thing that mattered to me was that it was empty. By the fourth night, I started noticing small things that felt off. It started with little noises outside the cabin. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. Nothing too alarming, but strange considering how isolated I was. I told myself it was just animals moving through the woods, but the feeling of being watched never really left me. Then I found the footprints. It had rained overnight, and the ground outside the cabin was soft with mud. When I stepped out that morning, I saw them, deep, heavy prints leading from the tree line straight to my cabin's door. My first thought was that Roger had come by unexpectedly, but the tracks didn't lead back. Whoever had made them had walked up to the door, stood there for a while, and then turned around and left the way they came. I hadn't heard a vehicle. There was no sign of anyone else around. I checked the lock on the cabin door, even though I knew I had bolted it the night before. It was still locked. Nothing inside had been disturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping into my gut. Someone had been outside my cabin in the middle of the night, standing there, watching. That day, I walked the perimeter of the property, trying to find any sign of who had been there. I found nothing. No tire tracks, no sign of a campsite, nothing that suggested another person had been anywhere nearby. It didn't make sense. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside had me sitting up in bed, straining to hear. A few times, I swore I heard footsteps, but they were too light, too careful, almost like someone was deliberately trying not to be heard. I gripped the hunting knife I kept by my bed, willing myself to stay calm. I told myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I found something worse than footprints. Near the tree line, about 30 feet from the cabin, someone had placed a small pile of rocks. They weren't there the day before. It was a deliberate stack, too perfect to be natural. At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of marker left by hunters, but the placement didn't make sense. It was positioned so that, from the right angle, it had a clear line of sight to my cabin. Someone had been watching me. I kicked the pile over, then spent most of the day gathering firewood, making as much noise as possible. I wanted whoever was out there to know that I wasn't some helpless camper. That night, I kept my knife close and slept with my boots on, just in case. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps just outside the cabin. My pulse slammed in my ears as I lay there, listening. The steps were careful, almost measured. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They were taking their time. Then they stopped. I held my breath, waiting. A moment later, the doorknob rattled. My stomach clenched. The door was locked, but that didn't matter. Someone was testing it, seeing if I had left it open. I gripped my knife tighter, barely breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. No retreating footsteps, no rustling leaves, just silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning finally came, I stepped outside, half expecting to see more footprints. But the only new thing I found was a second pile of rocks, right where the first one had been. This time, I didn't touch it. I had a choice to make. I could stay and risk another night, or I could leave. But leaving meant a long walk through the woods before I even reached the dirt road, and if whoever was out there wanted to stop me, I'd be exposed the entire way. I decided to stay one more night. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I needed answers. That evening, I set up a trap. I tied a few tin cans together and hung them from a string near the door. If someone tried to approach, they'd make noise. I also placed my axe near the bed, within easy reach. I barely slept. Sometime past midnight, the sound came again. Footsteps, but this time they weren't careful. They were fast. Then, the tin cans clattered against each other, and something slammed into the door. I bolted upright, gripping my knife. The door shook, rattling on its hinges. Then silence. For what felt like hours, I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for the next noise. But it never came. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. The second rock pile was gone. In its place was something else. A deer skull, stripped clean, placed directly in front of my cabin. That was it. I packed my things, grabbed the satellite phone, and called Roger. He didn't answer. I didn't care. I was done. I threw my gear into the truck, gunned the engine, and tore out of there without looking back. I never told Roger what happened. When he finally called back a few days later, I just told him I wasn't cut out for the job. I didn't want to explain. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who or what had been out there with me. I never planned to stay at the cabin for long. It was supposed to be a quiet, temporary retreat, a place where I could clear my mind, away from the noise of the city. My uncle had owned the property for years, but he rarely stayed there. He had bought it as a cheap investment, more for the land than the cabin itself. It was old, run down, and sat on the edge of an abandoned cemetery. I wasn't thrilled about the location, but I figured I wouldn't be there long enough for it to matter. I just needed a break, a couple of months at most. I had been dealing with too much stress, and the idea of a secluded place where I could be alone sounded perfect. The drive out there was long, stretching through miles of empty countryside. The closest town was about a half hour away, and even that wasn't much. A handful of stores, a gas station, and a diner. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun was already beginning to dip below the treeline. The sky had that cold, grayish tint that always seemed to linger in the autumn months. I parked the truck on the patch of dirt beside the cabin and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and earth. Everything around me was still. No cars, no people. Just the sound of wind pushing through the trees. The cabin itself looked worse than I remembered. The wooden boards were cracked and splintered in places, the roof sagged slightly, and the windows were covered in grime. It was clear that no one had taken care of it in years. I grabbed my bags from the truck and walked up the short steps to the porch. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. Dust floated in the air, settling on the wooden floor and the old furniture. The place smelled of damp wood and neglect. I dropped my bags in the small living room and moved to open the windows, letting in some fresh air. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. There was no TV, no internet, no distractions. That was the point. After setting up my things, I went outside to take a better look at my surroundings. The trees pressed close to the cabin, their bare branches swaying slightly. Beyond them, just past the backyard, was the cemetery. I had seen it before, but it always made me uneasy. It wasn't a proper graveyard with neat rows of headstones. It was old, forgotten. The stones were crumbling, some knocked over, half buried in the earth. The graves were scattered randomly, no organization to them. Some of the wooden crosses had rotted down to nothing. I didn't like looking at it for too long. I spent the rest of the evening unpacking, cooking a simple meal and settling in. As the sun fully disappeared, the temperature dropped, and I started a fire in the old wood stove. It crackled softly, the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. That night, I barely slept, not because of fear or discomfort, but because of the absolute stillness. I wasn't used to it. The quiet was so deep it felt unnatural, as if I had stepped into a place that had been abandoned by the rest of the world. Then, around midnight, I heard something. A soft, distant sound, barely there. It wasn't a voice, not footsteps, something else. A faint movement in the trees, a shifting. I sat up in bed, listening, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was the wind. The next day, I busied myself with repairs. I fixed up some of the broken furniture, cleaned the dust-covered windows, and patched a few holes in the walls. I chopped wood for the stove and stacked it neatly outside. As the sun began to set again, I made the mistake of looking toward the cemetery. Something was different. One of the gravestones near the edge of the woods had fallen over. I was sure it had been upright the day before. Maybe it had been loose, knocked over by the wind or a passing animal. I told myself that and went back inside. That night, I heard it again. A sound outside, closer. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind, it was movement. Something shifting through the leaves. Something deliberate. I got up slowly, moving to the window. The fire in the wood stove cast a faint glow across the room, but outside was pure darkness. Then I saw it. A shape, not an animal, not a person, just a dark outline standing near the tree-line, near the cemetery. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. The figure didn't either. I stared for what felt like forever, my mind racing. Then, without a sound, it stepped backward, slowly vanishing into the trees. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening, waiting, but the sound never returned. By morning, I had convinced myself that I had imagined it. Lack of sleep, stress, paranoia. The cemetery played tricks on my mind. I decided to check the gravestones. The one that had fallen over was different again. It had been moved, turned slightly. That was when I noticed the footprints. Not fresh, not deep, but there, just barely pressed into the damp earth, leading toward the cabin. I tried to shake the unease, but it stayed with me all day. I kept checking the windows, glancing toward the trees, waiting for something. That night, I locked the doors and windows, stoked the fire, and sat awake with a knife in my hand. The sound returned, closer, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves outside the window. I forced myself to stay still, to listen. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then 3 slow taps on the window. I stopped breathing. I didn't move. Minutes passed. An hour. The sound never came again. By the time the sun rose, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things as fast as I could, shoving everything into my truck. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to be gone. As I started the engine, I risked one last glance at the cemetery. The gravestone had been moved again, but this time the name was visible, the same last name as mine. I didn't stay long enough to read the rest. I just drove, leaving the cabin behind, leaving whatever was out there behind. I never told my uncle, never asked him about the history of the place. I just knew I wouldn't be going back, and I never did. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, when the world is too quiet, I remember the sound of those slow, deliberate taps against the window, and I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. It was late autumn when I found myself on that lonely stretch of road, the kind that carves through the woods like a forgotten scar. The leaves had turned shades of rust and gold, but the sky was a dull gray, heavy with the promise of rain. I had finished a job at my boss's property a few miles back. Some maintenance work, fixing up fences, checking on the well, that sort of thing. He had mentioned that his grandmother's old cabin was nearby, tucked away in the thick trees. "Don't bother stopping," he had said offhandedly, his tone casual but firm. No one's been there for years. I hadn't planned on stopping. My only goal was to make it home before the weather turned. The road was narrow, cracked in places, and winding enough that I had to keep both hands tight on the wheel. The sun had dipped below the treetops, and the light was fading fast. I passed the turnoff where I knew the cabin was, just a barely visible path cutting into the trees. And that's when I noticed something strange. There was a car, an old one, parked just off the road near the entrance to that path. It wasn't a modern vehicle, more like something from the early 2000s. It was dark green, caked in dirt, and the windows were fogged up. The way it sat there, angled awkwardly with one wheel slightly off the road, made it look like someone had pulled in fast and left in a hurry. But I hadn't seen anyone. There were no fresh footprints in the dirt or signs of movement in the trees. A part of me told me to keep driving. It wasn't my business. But another part, the part that knew how empty these roads could be at night, made me slow down. What if someone was inside, injured, or in trouble? I pulled over onto the shoulder, keeping my truck running. The moment I stepped out, I felt the cold settle deep into my bones. The air smelled damp, like wet leaves and earth, and the only sound was the rustling of branches overhead. I approached the car cautiously, peering through the driver's side window. The inside was a mess. There were old food wrappers, a few empty water bottles, and a torn-up map sitting on the passenger seat. The back seat was cluttered with clothes, but there was no sign of anyone. That should have been my cue to leave. But my eyes caught something else. The driver's door wasn't fully closed. It was cracked open just enough that the cabin light should have been on. But it wasn't. The car's battery must have been dead. I reached out and nudged the door open wider. The smell hit me immediately. It wasn't just the stale, musty scent of an abandoned car. It was something worse, rotting, pungent, like meat left out too long. I took a step back, my stomach twisting. Then I saw them. Footprints. They led away from the car, disappearing into the overgrown path toward the cabin. It didn't make sense. If someone had abandoned the car, why would they head deeper into the woods instead of toward the road? That was the moment I should have left. But I didn't. I told myself I'd just follow the footprints a little way, just enough to see if someone needed help. The path was barely visible, more like an animal trail than a real road. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots. Then up ahead I saw it, the cabin. It was old, even older than I expected. The roof sagged in places, and the walls were dark with years of exposure. There was no glass in the windows anymore, just empty frames staring out like hollow eyes. The door was slightly ajar, swinging faintly with the breeze. I stopped just before the clearing, every instinct in me screaming that something was wrong. Then I saw the second set of footprints. They were fresh, and they were coming out of the cabin. I wasn't alone. I turned around immediately, moving fast but careful to keep my steps quiet. My truck wasn't far. I could make it back, get inside, and be gone in less than 5 minutes. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate rustling in the trees. Someone was moving. I picked up my pace, forcing myself not to run. Running made noise. Running made you a target. The trees thinned. I could see the road ahead. My truck. The door still open. The engine still running. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stepping out from the trees. He was tall but thin. Too thin. His clothes were dark, blending into the shadows, but his face was pale, almost white, and his eyes. I didn't stop to look. I ran. I reached my truck, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. The moment I locked the doors, something slammed against the back of the truck. I didn't look. I threw it into gear and hit the gas. Gravel sprayed as I sped down the road, my heart hammering. In the rearview mirror, the figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching. I didn't stop driving. By the time I made it home, my hands were still shaking. I never told my boss what happened. Never mentioned the car, the footprints, the figure in the woods. A few weeks later, I heard a rumor. Someone had gone missing near that road. A hiker. No one had found him. I don't go near that cabin anymore, and I don't pass that road at night. I had been working as a forestry surveyor for a little over 5 years when I got assigned to a project that took me deep into a remote stretch of woodland. It was an old-growth forest, dense and unwelcoming, the kind of place where silence sat heavy between the trees. My job was simple in theory: stay in a cabin, mark out designated areas for clearing, and report back after a couple of weeks. Simple but lonely. The company had an old logging cabin out there, used decades ago but abandoned when the area was deemed too difficult for large-scale operations. It was sturdy, they said, reinforced over the years by other surveyors and loggers who had passed through. I wasn't new to solitude or hard conditions, so I accepted the assignment without hesitation. The drive was long, miles of empty road before I had to switch to a rugged path barely fit for my truck. I reached the cabin just before dusk. It was an old thing, sitting in a clearing with its back against a steep incline. The wooden walls were darkened by time, the roof patched with mismatched shingles. There was a small porch, a single window with thick shutters, and a heavy door with a rusted lock. It smelled of damp wood and age when I stepped inside. The inside was simple: a cot, a wooden table with a chair, a shelf with some supplies, and an old wood-burning stove. The last surveyor had left some notes, warnings about the unreliable generator, the occasional bear sighting, and a reminder to stack firewood early since the forest got cold at night. The first few days passed without much trouble. I worked during the day, marking trees and mapping trails. The forest was dense, and moving through it was slow. The trees were enormous, their canopies so thick that even midday felt like early evening. The wind barely reached the ground, and everything smelled of damp earth and pine. At night, the cabin felt much smaller than it did during the day. I kept a fire going, cooked simple meals, and read through my notes. The silence was something I was used to, but there was something about the quiet in that forest that felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like something was always listening. By the fourth day, I started noticing small things that put me on edge. First, my tools had been moved. Not in a way that suggested I had misplaced them, something deliberate. My measuring tape was unrolled and draped over the table. My axe, which I had left leaning against the wall, was stuck upright in the wooden floor. I told myself I must have done it without thinking, tired from the long days. Then there were the tracks. I had woken up early, just before dawn, and stepped outside to take a piss. The ground was damp from the night's rain, soft enough to show impressions. There were footprints in the mud, circling the cabin. They were human, barefoot, long strides, but they weren't mine. I tried to stay rational. Maybe an old hunter or another surveyor had passed through, curious about the cabin. But it didn't make sense. I had seen no sign of anyone else out here. That night, I secured the cabin before sleeping. The shutters were locked, the door barricaded from the inside. The fire burned low, filling the space with warmth. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It was soft, almost careful, like someone was testing the ground with each step. I lay still, my breath shallow. The sound moved to the door, stopping just outside. Then came the slow, deliberate scrape of something dragging across the wood. I sat up, heart hammering, reaching for my knife. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed. Then, from the other side of the room, I heard the floorboards creak. Inside the cabin. I turned so fast I nearly knocked over the chair next to the cot. The fire had burned low, casting weak orange light that barely reached the corners of the room. Nothing was there. The door was still barricaded. The window shutters were closed. I stayed awake until morning, sitting with my back against the wall, knife in hand. When daylight came, I checked the cabin. Nothing was missing. The only thing out of place was the chair by the table. It had been pulled out, slightly angled toward my cot. I spent the day working, trying to push away the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest felt different. The silence was heavier. The trees looked closer together, the spaces between them darker. That night, I kept the fire roaring, not letting it die down. I forced myself to eat to keep my routine normal. I checked the door 3 times before lying down. Sleep came slowly. I woke up to the sound of the door handle turning. Not rattling, not shaking, just a slow, careful turn, as if whoever was outside was testing to see if it was unlocked. The barricade held. I didn't move. The handle stopped turning. Silence. Then a whisper of movement, the soft scrape of feet stepping away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my things. The job wasn't done, but I didn't care. When I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints. There. Dozens of them circling the cabin. Some led into the forest, but none came from it. I didn't think. I got into my truck, turned the key, and drove. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I reached the nearest town hours later, shaking from exhaustion. I told my boss I was done with the project. I didn't explain why. I don't know who was out there. Maybe it was just some drifter, someone living off the grid. Maybe I was overreacting. But I know one thing. I had locked the door, and in the morning when I left, it was open. I never went back. I never thought much about isolation until I stayed in that cabin. I had spent time alone before, gone on long hikes, camped in remote areas, but nothing quite like this. The woods of southern France seemed peaceful when I arrived, too peaceful in hindsight. It was late September, and the summer crowds had long since vanished, leaving the forests empty except for the occasional hunter or traveler passing through. I was staying in an old, one-room cabin deep in the woods near the Dordogne region. It belonged to a friend of a friend, some retired man who had inherited the land and rarely used it. It wasn't much, just a single-room structure with a wood-burning stove, a cot, and a small kitchen area with a rusted sink. There was no electricity, only an old oil lantern and a stockpile of candles. I had driven in with enough supplies for a week: canned food, a few bottles of water, some dry firewood, and a hunting knife. The plan was simple: enjoy the solitude, take some photographs, and get away from the noise of the city. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring the nearby trails, taking in the crisp autumn air, and snapping pictures of the thick, moss-covered trees. There was something about the silence that was both calming and unsettling. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. That first night, I built a small fire outside and cooked some canned beans. The sky was clear, the stars bright. It felt like I had the entire world to myself. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The cabin was dark, the fire outside had long since died down, and the woods were silent. But something had pulled me from my sleep. A noise, maybe. I lay still for a moment, listening. Then, from somewhere outside, I heard it again. A faint crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. My first thought was an animal. A deer, maybe, or a fox. I reached for my knife, just in case, and sat up. Silence. Then another crunch, this time closer. I moved slowly toward the door and pressed my ear against the wood. The sound was coming from just beyond the tree line, maybe 15 or 20 meters away. It wasn't the erratic movement of an animal. It was steady, almost like footsteps. I waited, gripping the knife tightly. Then, nothing. After several minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a branch had fallen, or the wind had stirred the leaves. I crawled back into my cot, but I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the area outside. Nothing unusual. No tracks, no broken branches, just the same undisturbed forest floor. I brushed it off as paranoia and went about my day. By the second night, I had almost forgotten about it. I made a small dinner, drank some water, and sat outside for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Then, just like the night before, I woke up suddenly. It was the same feeling, like something had disturbed me just enough to pull me out of sleep. I lay still, waiting. Then I heard it, closer this time. The sound of footsteps, not the heavy steps of a large animal, not the light scurrying of a fox or rabbit. These were human footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. My heart pounded. I reached for my knife and listened. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped. Silence. I held my breath. I couldn't hear anything, but I could feel it, that presence just outside. Then the doorknob rattled. Not violently, not forcefully, just enough to test if it was unlocked. I gripped my knife tighter, my hands clammy with sweat. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, slowly fading into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. To first light, I packed my things. I had planned to stay a week, but I wasn't taking any chances. I wasn't waiting to see who or what was outside that cabin at night. I checked the area again before leaving. No tracks, no signs of disturbance, just the same quiet, empty woods. I drove away, back toward civilization, leaving the cabin behind. I never told my friend what happened. I don't know if I imagined it, if it was just paranoia, or if someone had really been out there, watching me. All I know is that I never went back, and I never will. It was late October when I decided to take a break from everything. The past few months had been exhausting. Work, personal issues, everything piling up. I needed space. I needed quiet. So, I packed up and drove out to a small cabin I had rented deep in the mountains. It wasn't my first time out there, but I had never gone alone before. The place was about a 3-hour drive from town. Far enough that I wouldn't hear traffic or deal with people, but close enough that I could get back if something happened. The road leading up to it was rough, mostly gravel and dirt, cutting through thick forests with no streetlights. By the time I got there, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin was small but solid. A single-story structure with a pitched roof, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch. The nearest neighbor was miles away, but I didn't mind. That was the point. I unpacked, made a quick meal, and settled in. The silence was almost too much at first. No sirens, no cars, no voices. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustling of leaves. It should have been peaceful, but something about it made me uneasy. I didn't sleep well. It wasn't that I was scared. Not yet. But the sounds outside kept pulling me from sleep. Every now and then, I'd hear movement. Branches snapping, leaves crunching. Could have been anything, raccoons, deer, maybe even a bear. But it felt wrong. The noises weren't random. They had a pattern, like something pacing around the cabin. I told myself I was imagining it. I was out in the woods, alone, my mind playing tricks on me. But when I woke up the next morning, I found something strange. Tracks. They weren't boot prints. They weren't even animal tracks, not any that I recognized. They were long, too long, and deep, like something with weight had moved through. The strangest part was how they circled the cabin, over and over. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had made them last night, though I didn't remember walking around in the dark. Maybe it was just the wind making patterns in the dirt. I didn't know. I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head. The trails were quiet, untouched. I saw a few deer, some birds, but nothing unusual. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting again. I made dinner, read for a while, and told myself I was being ridiculous, until the noises started again. It was worse this time, louder, closer. I lay in bed, listening. The footsteps weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. They moved slowly, circling, stopping, then starting again. I had locked the doors, shut the windows, but I still felt exposed, like something was watching me. Then came the smell. It drifted in through the walls, thick and rotten, like something dead had been left out in the sun for too long. I covered my nose, trying not to gag. The footsteps stopped. The cabin was silent. The smell lingered, but everything else was still. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noises were gone. I barely slept, but when morning came, I forced myself outside. The tracks were there again, circling the cabin. But this time, they led off into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. They weren't normal. The strides were too long, the shape of the prints all wrong. My first thought was that someone was messing with me. But who would come all the way out here just to scare some guy in a cabin? I followed them a few yards into the trees before stopping. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I turned back. That was the moment I decided I would leave in the morning. I locked everything, checked twice. I kept the fire going, the rifle close by. I didn't care if it was paranoia. I wasn't taking chances. The noises came back around midnight. At first, it was the footsteps, slow, deliberate. Then the breathing. It was faint, but I heard it, just outside the window. Low, raspy, wrong. I didn't move. Then came the scratching. Long, slow drags against the wooden walls. Not claws, but something harder, rougher. It moved around the cabin, scratching, scraping, circling me. Then it stopped. Silence. And then, knocking. Not at the door, at the window. Soft, rhythmic, like it was trying to get my attention. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The knocking came again. And then, from outside, something whispered my name. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the chair, rifle in my lap, waiting for the sun to come up. When light finally broke through the trees, I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't look at the tracks outside. I didn't check the windows. I just got in my truck and left. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Only then did I pull over, hands shaking, breath ragged. I looked back once, just once. There, at the tree line, something was standing. Tall, too tall, its limbs too long, its head slightly tilted. Watching me, I slammed my foot on the gas and didn't look back again. I never told anyone what happened. Not really, but I never went back to that cabin. Never again. And sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it. Knocking. I took the last turn off the paved road, my truck bouncing slightly as I hit the dirt path leading up to the cabin. It was late in the afternoon, and the shadows stretched long across the narrow road, the light barely filtering through the thick trees surrounding me on both sides. I hadn't been out here in years, but I still remembered every bump and curve in the path. My uncle used to own this place, and when he passed, the cabin had been left to me. I had no real connection to it, no childhood memories of summers spent fishing or hunting, just a vague recollection of a single weekend trip when I was a kid. But I needed a break, and I figured a long weekend away from work and noise wouldn't hurt. The last few months had been exhausting. My job had me stretched thin, my social life had faded, and even sleep felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. A weekend of quiet, just me, my truck, and the woods. No cell service, no emails, no one to talk to. That was exactly what I needed. The driveway was nothing more than a break in the tree line, and I almost missed it in the fading light. The cabin sat a little ways in, just far enough from the road that you wouldn't see it unless you were looking for it. As I pulled up, I got my first real look at the place in years. It was smaller than I remembered. A simple wooden structure with a covered porch and a chimney that looked like it hadn't seen smoke in a decade. The windows were dusty, the roof had seen better days, and the front steps creaked as I walked up to the door. I unlocked it and stepped inside, the air stale with the smell of dust and wood that had been left to sit too long. The place was basic, one large room that served as both the living area and kitchen, a small bathroom, and a single bedroom off to the side. The furniture was old but solid, the kind that looked like it had been around for 50 years and would still be here 50 more. A thick layer of dust coated everything, and I spent the first hour wiping down the counters and sweeping the floors before finally settling in. The silence was almost overwhelming. No cars in the distance, no hum of electricity, just the wind moving through the trees outside and the occasional creak of the old wooden walls. It was peaceful in a way, but also unnerving. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. I spent the first night by the fireplace, reading by lantern light. There was no power out here, no running water besides what I had brought with me. The fire crackled, the warmth seeping into my skin as I let myself relax. I hadn't realized how much I needed this. I went to bed late, the air cold against my skin as I settled into the old bed with a pile of blankets. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees, making them groan in the darkness. I barely noticed when I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there, my heart beating a little faster than I liked, I realized it was different. The wind made the trees sway, made the branches rub against each other. But this was movement, something deliberate, something heavy. I sat up slowly, listening. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. The sound came again, a crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, but then I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, steady, someone walking just outside the cabin. I held my breath. The footsteps moved from the side of the house toward the porch. My truck was parked just a few feet away. Whoever it was had to know I was here. They had to have seen the light from the fire. I moved as quietly as I could, slipping out of bed and grabbing the rifle I had brought with me. It wasn't loaded, but I didn't think I'd need to fire it. Just having it in my hands made me feel a little more in control. I stood in the dark, listening. The footsteps had stopped. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat up with my back against the wall, the rifle across my lap, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the sky began to lighten, the dark shadows fading into the early morning gray. I stepped outside as the sun rose, my breath visible in the cold air. There were tracks in the dirt, footprints. I wasn't imagining it. The tracks circled the cabin, leading from the tree line, past the porch and back into the woods. Someone had been out here. I spent the day trying to shake the unease from the night before. I chopped firewood, took a short hike down to the lake, and tried to convince myself that it was probably just some hunter passing through. But the feeling stayed, that heavy weight in my chest, the sense that I wasn't alone out here. That night, I barricaded the door. I wedged a chair under the handle, placed a heavy log against the back door, and sat by the fire with my rifle loaded this time. I wasn't taking any chances. The night passed in silence. No footsteps, no movement. By the time the sun came up, I felt ridiculous. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe the tracks had been old, or I had just imagined the footsteps being so close. Either way, I decided to stay one more night. I wasn't going to let my own paranoia ruin this trip. That evening, I sat outside on the porch, drinking a beer and watching the last of the daylight disappear. The woods were calm, the air still, and then I saw it, a shape just beyond the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it wasn't an animal. I stared at it for what felt like forever, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, slowly, it stepped back, disappearing into the trees. That was enough for me. I packed up what little I had brought and loaded my truck in record time. I didn't care if it was late, if I had to drive all night. I wasn't staying out here. As I pulled away from the cabin, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing, just darkness, just trees. By the time I hit the main road, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the property a few months later, never told the new owners about that weekend. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe there was a logical explanation, but I know what I saw, and I know I was never alone out there.